키토 다이어트는 탄수화물을 극도로 제한하는 다이어트입니다. 그것이 건강과 다이어트에 좋다는 걸 잘 이해했어도 실행하기란 쉽지 않습니다. 우리가 평생 주식으로 먹어왔던 탄수화물 대신 많은 양의 지방을 먹는 키토제닉 식단은 신체적으로 그리고 심리적으로도 꽤나 도전적인 일입니다. 그렇다면 다른 방법은 없을까요? 댄메그 박사는 일반 식단과 키토 다이어트의 중간 지점에 있는 저탄수화물 식단에 대해 다음과 같이 이야기합니다.
Yes, both low-carb diets and ketogenic diets involve restricting the amount of carbohydrates. As a starting point, let's consider what most people in the Western world eat on a daily basis. It's going to be a combination of all sorts of bread, rice, pasta, some protein, maybe not enough, and if they've been listening to what our governments have been preaching for the last 50 years, not very much fat. It varies quite a lot from person to person and from country to country, and clearly not everyone is following their government's advice to the letter. But broadly speaking, the standard Western diet is upwards of 250 grams of carbohydrate per day per person, and often considerably more. And as many of us learnt at school, but most of us have forgotten, is that all of the starches in the bread, rice and pasta break down into glucose once they're in the body. Glucose, which is commonly called the blood sugar, can be used by cells all over the body for energy. It can also be stored as fat. Fat cells turn excess glucose into fat for storage.
여기서 댄메그 박사는 현대인의 식단과 각 나라의 정부 지침에 관해 이야기했는데요. 사실 우리나라도 여기서 크게 벗어나지 않습니다. 먼저 식단을 살펴보면 아시다시피 우리나라는 탄수화물 섭취 비중이 매우 높습니다. 2021년 질병관리청에서 조사한 국민 영양 통계에 따르면 한국인의 하루 탄수화물 섭취량은 약 260g입니다. 우리 정부는 국민들의 비만 감소를 위해 어떤 일을 하고 있는지도 살펴보았는데요. 우리나라는 아직까지도 비만의 원인을 탄수화물보다는 소금이나 지방이라고 생각하는 것 같습니다.
Let's compare that to a low carbohydrate diet, which as you probably can guess aims to reduce the amount of carbohydrate consumed. If you're consuming less carbohydrates, you'll end up with less glucose in your blood, and therefore your pancreas will produce less insulin. The reason that is important is because insulin is our main fat storage hormone. It's what triggers those fat cells to take up the glucose and store it. That's why doctors, whenever we start anyone on insulin injections, we always warn them that the main side effect is weight gain. Having lower insulin levels allows us to actually use our fat stores for energy rather than simply keep adding to them. So how low is low carb? There's no universal definition of how low a low carb diet should be. Lots of scientific papers use less than 130 grams a day, but if you read around the internet, you're going to find figures quoted from anywhere between 100 to 150 grams a day. So that's around half of the amount of carbohydrates when compared to a standard diet. But what does a low carb diet look like? Well, in practice, that means you're going to be significantly reducing your intake of bread, rice, pasta, basically all of those white or beige foods. Importantly, you're going to be significantly reducing your intake of refined sugars. And you can pretty much eat all vegetables on a low carb diet, but you're going to be wanting to manage the portion sizes when it comes to starchy vegetables like potatoes. Similarly, you're going to be limiting but not eliminating fruit. Because we're cutting back on carbohydrates, generally your protein and fat consumption will go up a little bit, and our bodies tend to adapt to a low carb diet quite quickly and easily, and you won't usually get any side effects when restricting carbohydrates to this kind of level. But there is an important safety point. If you're diabetic and on medication to lower blood glucose, you should always consult your doctor before starting a low carbohydrate diet, else you run the risk of dangerously low blood glucose levels. Now, unfortunately, not all doctors are comfortable adjusting the medication for low carbohydrate diets.
100g의 탄수화물은 밥으로 따지면 한 공기 반 정도의 양입니다. 하루에 3끼를 먹는다면 한 끼에 밥을 반 공기씩 먹는 셈입니다. 하지만 이렇게 밥의 양만 줄인다면 우리는 늘 배고플 것입니다. 따라서 우리는 탄수화물 섭취를 줄이는 동시에 단백질과 지방 섭취량을 늘려야 합니다. 지방과 단백질은 포만감을 오랫동안 유지하는 경향이 있기 때문에 밥의 양을 줄여도 충분히 만족스러운 식사를 할 수 있을 것입니다. 그리고 제가 추가로 제안드리고 싶은 것은 간식을 완전히 끊는 것입니다. 저탄수화물 식단은 인슐린 수치를 낮춰 지방 연소를 유도하는 것인데 만약 식사 사이에 간식을 먹는다면 그 효과를 망치게 될 것입니다.
Let's look at the ketogenic diet, or sometimes called the keto diet. If we restrict carbohydrates more aggressively, we'll get to a point where we're no longer consuming enough glucose to meet our body's basic needs. Now, running out of glucose like this isn't really something that most people in the modern world have to concern themselves with. Most of us have food security and an adequate supply of carbohydrates. But running out of glucose was a frequent challenge for our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Fortunately, we evolved a way around it, and we can simply switch to an alternative fuel source. When your body is running low on glucose, your liver will begin to produce a fuel called ketones, which it makes from fat. This can be the fat that we're consuming or the fat that is stored on our bodies, which, as you can imagine, is incredibly advantageous for those of us who are looking to lose excess weight. During the process of turning fat into ketones, your liver also produces some glucose, so your blood glucose won't drop completely, even if you stop eating carbohydrates altogether. Once ketone levels build up in your blood, you've entered a metabolic state called ketosis. The majority of the cells in your body will happily run on ketones as their main source of energy. For example, after 3 to 4 days of being on a ketogenic diet, 75% of the brain's energy source is from ketones. So the key thing that defines a ketogenic diet is that it causes the body to enter the metabolic state of ketosis. In order to get into ketosis, you must be consuming a very low level of carbohydrates. So we can consider that ketogenic diets are a subcategory of a low carbohydrate diet. All ketogenic diets are low carb, but not all low carb diets cause you to enter the metabolic state of ketosis. For this, how much do we need to restrict carbohydrates to get into ketosis? Well, I'd love to give you an exact figure, but the truth is that it varies from person to person. It can vary based on your activity levels, it can vary based on your genetics, it can vary based on your physical size. Clearly, someone who is 6'4" is going to have different needs to someone who is 5'1". But generally speaking, we're looking at somewhere between 20 and 50 grams of carbohydrate per day.
우리 몸은 하이브리드 차량처럼 상황에 맞게 주 에너지원을 바꿀 수 있게 진화해왔습니다. 그래서 먹을 것이 없을 때도 우리 조상들은 사냥을 할 수 있게 근육과 에너지를 보존할 수 있었고, 겨울에는 과일 없이 고기만 먹고도 살아갈 수 있었죠. 하지만 현대인들은 대부분 탄수화물을 주 에너지원으로 사용하며 살아왔습니다. 따라서 지방을 에너지원으로 사용하는 대사 능력은 상당히 떨어져 있는 상태일 수 있습니다. 이렇게 상황에 따라 대사 모드를 전환하는 능력을 대사적 유연성이라고 하는데요. 단순히 먹는 양을 줄이는 다이어트보다 몸의 대사 모드를 바꾸는 키토 다이어트는 적응에 더 오랜 시간이 걸릴 수 있습니다. 하지만 지방 대사 모드가 본격적으로 가동되기 시작하면 그동안 막막하게만 느껴졌던 다이어트가 그다지 어렵지 않다고 느껴지는 순간이 올 것입니다.
So what does a ketogenic diet actually look like? Well, most fruit and vegetables are restricted. Starchy vegetables, typically the ones that grow underground, like potatoes, are completely eliminated. Above ground vegetables like cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, lettuces are generally fine because they're very low in carbohydrates. Most fruits, other than berries, which are very low in carbohydrates, are also gone. You'll need to focus on consuming an adequate amount of protein for your body. Again, that will vary based on how active you are, and that's much the same as on a low carbohydrate diet. The big difference is that when you cut back on carbs so much, you need to replace those carbohydrates with fat. Importantly, and this is something that I see explained incorrectly time and time again, it's not the adding of the fat that causes the body to go into ketosis, it's the restriction of the carbohydrates. You go into ketosis if you just stop eating altogether. The increased fat consumption is to help you feel full after a meal. It's not there to trigger ketosis. So a ketogenic diet is usually described as a very low carb, moderate protein, higher fat diet. But doesn't eating fat make you fat? Well, there is this common misconception with the ketogenic diet that you're just spooding fat into your mouth all day, eating bacon and cheese and nothing else. But no, it's because ketones actually inhibit hunger and trigger a reset on the feedback systems that tell our brains to stop eating when we're full. Now, we don't fully know the mechanisms by which this occurs, and more research is definitely needed in this area. But people who are in ketosis therefore naturally restrict their food intake without the need for counting calories. The experience of hunger on a ketogenic diet is radically different. Most people will drop from eating 3 meals a day plus snacks to 2 meals a day or even 1 meal a day without really feeling hungry. But a ketogenic diet can cause some side effects. I mentioned earlier that a low carbohydrate diet is generally well tolerated by the body. But with a ketogenic diet, there are a set of transitional symptoms that are collectively known as keto flu. These occur when our bodies are simply not used to being in ketosis. For many of us, the only time we've ever spent in ketosis is when we've been unwell and not able to eat. It's important to note that side effects are to be expected and are not a sign that a ketogenic is not right for someone. all that is happening is there's a drop in insulin levels as a result of carbohydrate restriction, and that means the kidneys lose some fluids and electrolytes. Thankfully, these side effects are usually able to be minimized by focusing on hydration and electrolyte replacement. So both low-carb diets and ketogenic diets are low in carbohydrates, but the ketogenic diet is very low and therefore is higher in fat. A ketogenic diet is defined by the metabolic state of being in ketosis. There are some more transitional symptoms with a ketogenic diet, but these can be easily managed. And a ketogenic diet is by its very nature more restrictive than a standard low-carb diet. But in some ways that makes it simpler. Some people love the clarity of being able to test their ketone levels and say, yes, I'm in ketosis. But given that our governments have been pushing a low-fat message for pretty much the last 50 years, it's natural that some people have safety concerns about the additional fat you need to consume on a ketogenic diet.
두 가지 다이어트의 가장 큰 차이점은 탄수화물 섭취량입니다. 그리고 이것이 모든 차이를 만들어냅니다. 단순히 효과만 비교하면 당연히 키토다이어트가 더 좋습니다. 하지만 심각한 것이 아니더라도 초반에 겪게 되는 작은 부작용들은 다이어트의 의욕을 많이 떨어뜨릴 수 있습니다. 그리고 제한되는 사항이 많은 만큼 지속 가능성이 떨어지는 단점도 있습니다. 따라서 저탄수화물 식단은 키토 다이어트를 시작하기 부담스러운 분들에게 좋은 대안이 될 수 있습니다. 제가 마지막으로 드리고 싶은 조언은 운동의 점진적 과부하라는 원칙이 있습니다. 쉽게 말해서 신체가 적응할 수 있게 운동 강도를 점진적으로 높이라는 건데요. 이것은 다이어트를 포함해서 무언가를 배우는 모든 일에 적용할 수 있습니다. 하지만 다이어트를 할 때는 많은 분들이 이 법칙을 무시하는 것 같습니다. 먹고 싶은 음식을 양껏 먹으며 살아온 분이 다이어트를 한다고 하면 갑자기 프로 보디빌더 선수처럼 식단을 합니다. 이것은 평소에는 운동 한번 안 해본 사람이 갑자기 내일 철인 3종 경기를 뛰겠다고 하는 것처럼 절대로 성공할 수 없는 전략입니다. 키토 다이어트도 마찬가지입니다. 저는 지금껏 계속해서 하루에 단 한 끼만이라도 키토제닉 식단으로 먹어보라고 권해왔는데요. 단 한 번의 경험이 점진적으로 키토식의 비중을 늘릴 수 있는 계기가 될 수 있다라고 생각하기 때문입니다. 당장의 빠른 성공을 바라기보다는 도중에 포기하지 않도록 지속 가능한 방법으로 해나가는 것이 성공 가능성을 높여줄 것입니다. 이상한 다이어트였습니다.